Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're going to commence now with a presentation by two artists and a discussion. On my right is Robert Semper, who is an artist, researcher, and member of the sound art collective Ultra Red, which organizes projects around constituencies involved in migrant rights, the AIDS crisis, fair housing, and anti-racism. He's been a fellow during the last year at the Veralist Center for Art and Politics at the New School in New York City, and in the past he's taught at Columbia University and the University of California at Los Angeles. And on my left is Dmitry Vilensky, an artist, writer, and founding member of Chateau Delat's The What Is to Be Done, a platform initiated in 2003, as we've heard earlier today, by a collective of artists, critics, philosophers, and writers with the goal of merging political theory, art, and activism. He's also an editor of the Chateau Delat's newspaper. So the way this is going to work is that Robert is going to make a brief presentation, 10 to 15 minutes, of his work with Ultra Red, and then Dmitry is going to make his presentation, and then we'll have the discussion, and I think we're going to soon after relatively quickly turn to the audience to try to involve the audience and try to reinvent the possibilities of collective action today, if we can. Robert, I'll hand it over to you now.
Okay, let me take this. Hi, everyone. Dmitry and I were joking towards the end of the last session that actually was a really fabulous sort of punctuation to this whole event. And that really, what the hell are we doing here? As the very last session, the only one that sort of is not like the double session, right? And that we're a little bit like the afterthought. And perhaps that actually is a good way of thinking about this, is the thinking that comes after. That this can be a kind of a little bit of a process of reflection. It reminds me a little bit of the sort of avant-garde musician, British musician Cornelius Cardew's definition of improvisation, which was the search for a sound with which to interpret a context. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about sound in the next few minutes. But essentially, an opportunity to actually begin to take some measure of the resonances that exist now following these hours of very sort of intense engagement that have occurred here. It's also a happy coincidence that actually the collectives that we are both a part of have at their center very particular questions. We are organized, we have as our foundation, in a certain sense, a question each. The question, what is to be done for Chateau Delat, and then for Ultra Red, which I will also be talking briefly about, the question, what did you hear? And so I actually will probably be asking those questions a lot over the next hour and a half. But I invite you to begin actually taking up those two questions. What did you hear, and what is to be done? And that maybe these are ways of beginning to structure this afterthought that we are involved in at this point. The comments I'm going to make, I'm probably going to actually kind of condense myself even from my prepared notes. The comments that I'm going to make will not in any way attempt to encompass the enormous possibilities of this particular session. In the abstract that Dmitry and I prepared for this session many weeks ago, one of the things that we sort of signaled possibly doing was to look at what comes from the sort of parallel conditions of the events of perestroika and the ending of apartheid in South Africa. I am not going to be talking about that in these notes. It's something I would be very interested in discussing, should that, for example, be one of the things that emerges in the course of our conversation. That's to signal one of the possibilities, one of the openings through which we may want to pass over the next hour and a half. For the time being, however, I'd like to focus on Ultra-Rail a little bit. It's not a collective that I think many of you probably know about. You may have heard of our work, but don't really know too much about it. There are 9 of us, and we are distributed unevenly across Europe and the United States. In a certain sense, we are not located in any particular city. We are often referred to as a sound art collective, but I think listening collective may be a more accurate, albeit less transparent term. Discussing our work at this point in the Congress is particularly interesting, for very little has been said thus far about sound or listening. This is possibly due to the very conceit of this gathering, the notion of the horizon as a fundamental property of the art-politics nexus. Thus far, the horizon has manifest primarily as a visual trope. It is image, vista, orientation, or vanishing point. We have heard it presented as something contemplated from afar or a point towards which one moves. The deepening yesterday of the consideration of movement and even embodiment in, for example, Beatrice Colomina and Sudabrata Sungupta's presentations suggested other domains or vectors through which to consider this trope. Architecture may be the organizing of space, and this organizing certainly conditions visuality. It also conditions sound and movement. The sound of the city and the sounding of the city, the spatial as well as temporal shifts marked by sound and the active use of sound to navigate the city are produced by architecture and also exceed its limits. Similarly with movement, architecture has its choreography. Given this, something I hope Dmitry and I are able to touch on together is the place of embodiment in our work, more specifically the decisions we have made fairly recently concerning the use of dance. This is at the very edge of what I am confident discussing, which is probably the best argument for actually discussing it. I am eager to learn more about dance, as I suspect that dance, which emerged beautifully yesterday in the forms of the dervish and Nobad and Sudabrata's commentary, and in the action of the free-falling today in Hito's presentation, may contribute an alternate or additional vocabulary to the idea of the horizon. But for now, sound. When John Cage was asked to name his favorite music, a question he was asked fairly often, he frequently responded that it was the sound of the traffic on 6th Avenue in Manhattan, heard from the apartment he shared with his lover and collaborator, the dancer and choreographer Merce Cunningham. This was another in a series of adjustments Cage made to the conventions of composition and listening. His most famous or notorious, of course, was the 1952 composition event, 433, which is almost always described as 4.5 minutes of silence. Yet even Cage describes the piece as a canvas for other sounds. Indeed, it poured with rain during the early performance in an open-air venue in Woodstock, New York. The sound of the rain and the restless audience made for anything but silence. 433 is more about listening than it is about silence. It is more about fullness than absence. As a performance, it is an experience of listening in the presence of others. Thus, what 433 composes is not so much sounds, but listening as an experience of the potential of collectivity. In sound, the horizon is typically figured as some form of silence, as in the limit, either phenomenological or epistemological, of perception. For the sound artist, the construction of silence can be defamiliarized with a simple intervention that asks the listener to attend to sounds that are beyond the threshold of intention, as opposed to the threshold of hearing. In these instances, the command, listen, is equivalent to a finger indicating a distant vanishing point. A few years ago, however, rather than commanding people to listen to the sounds we had composed, we invited them to listen by simply asking, "What did you hear?" The question, "What did you hear?" proposes a different role for the artist than finger pointing, and by association, a different relationship between the artists and those invited to describe what has been heard. We might describe that difference as one in which the horizon becomes less a fixed point towards which one gestures than a measure of movement that constructs and reconstructs thresholds of change. After listening with many groups, Ultra Red have come to think of the two different notions of horizon, the horizons of silence, as giving shape to different notions of politics. These conceptions enunciate different political practices. The first represents a politics, perhaps in the form of a critique or through the construction of a visual or oral image of a new political configuration. The second notion organizes a politics. While artists or activists may produce work that indicates a horizon, they may find that the horizon reciprocates the gesture, touches back, and brings them into a social situation that they might change and be changed by. This is only if we provide for ourselves the conditions for listening. In his earliest writings, the Brazilian radical educator Paulo Freire drew upon a notion of silence that resonates in many artistic and activist interventions. For Freire, the culture of silence, as he called it, was both the theft of the voice of the poor, as well as the complicity of the poor in their own oppression. Silence, therefore, and the culture of silence was the thing that had to be broken for liberation to be realized. However, much later in his life, Freire introduced into his writings a very different conception of silence. Thinking about the role of the teacher as one who facilitates the articulation and transformation of the desire of the other, Freire referred to teaching as adopting a discipline of silence, which is to say, a discipline of listening. Silence, therefore, is not just the culture that must be broken in order for liberation to occur. Silence is also the very condition for listening. The contradictions between these two propositions, silence as a symptom of oppression and silence as the condition for listening, is the point at which we attempt to position the investigations we undertake within the constituencies with which we are affiliated or by whom we have been invited into a collaboration. Paulo Freire's outline for what he terms thematic investigations has greatly informed our procedures of collective listening. Deeply rooted in the decolonizing project of the 1960s, Latin American popular education sought to develop critical analyses of the conditions of experience within a commitment to collective action. The analyses led to the production of terms that could be used for transformative interventions, for praxis. The thematic investigation unfolds through a mediation of experience in the form of representation, or more precisely in Freire's terminology, codifications. For example, photographs, drawings, songs, stories, sounds, plays, or some combination of these. The representations capture life situations familiar to the participants. For us, it is more often than not sight recordings. The investigation entails a movement back and forth between description and analysis in order to arrive at collective propositions about the conditions of experience. The investigators then test the propositions through the production of a new round of representations or sight recordings that are then collectively described and analyzed. How to represent a process without actually going into one. How to derive an understanding of listening without listening. Freire describes the thematic investigation process as world-making in order to underscore the promise that ideologies of naturalized experience may be revealed to be historically conditioned and therefore open to radical reconstruction. I want to emphasize that this is collective work, not the world as made image by artists functioning as intellectual patrons. The representation employed in the thematic analysis is constituted as a critical object informed by and used to launch the collective process of description and analysis. So rather than being the endpoint of an art process, representation offers a beginning. The artist does not pose the question and then leave, but stays to participate in the productive work of reflective silence. My understanding is that you hold out such hope for exhibitions as well, Simon. And as I heard it, the description that Beatrice Colomina provided yesterday of Clip Stamp Fold suggested not only that it is a shifting archive, expanding and reorganizing, it also possibly renews and organizes new collectives. The exhibition provides the conditions for organizing as its core experience. I hope I'm not being impolitely presumptive in hearing a deep common note in the presentations of Ultra-Red's work and the collective pedagogical impulse that was the origin of Clip Stamp Fold. The commonality extends to the investigative repetitions and shifting collectivities that defined each iteration of the project, of which the exhibition is only one part and not necessarily its conclusion, which I am reaching. Is it possible? Well, of course it's possible. But is it useful to discuss the notion of the horizon without combining it with the discussion of practice or method? Peter Osborne's enormously helpful and quite frankly intimidating dash through the phenomenological concept of the horizon reminded me that phenomenology is also a methodology, an epistemology that arises from a deliberate organizing of experience, which is, I suppose, a definition of art and politics. Yet as evidence of how profane discussions of the political have become within art, what artists would disagree with the statement that all art is political? But try to understand what is meant by the political, and the statement, as well as its confident delivery, dissolves. The word appears empty of meaning, or a repository of undifferentiated possibility. The work of the imagination. But whose imagination? And under what conditions? And for whom? And with whom? And to what end? In closing, I will share with you a proposition we reference when thinking of the terms of the political in our practice. Epicurus's origin tale as retold by Althusser in the beginning of the philosophy of the encounter. The universe was a rain of atoms. Then one atom swerved and came into contact with another. For something, for materiality itself to come from that encounter, one of those atoms must then come into contact with a second atom. For Althusser, the question of politics and revolutionary organizing is the question of organizing the conditions for the second encounter. Activism, I would suggest, is concerned with contributing to the conditions of the first encounter. Organizing, conversely, is concerned with the conditions of the second encounter, the encounter that occurs subsequently to a prior moment of contact, whose effect is realized in its repetition and accumulation. What did you hear? What is to be done?
Thanks, Robert. And now we'll hear from Dmitry.
Hi. It's really big challenge to speak at the end of such intensive 3 days, and also I think it's a very important setting for bringing our representative of two collectives together. And actually after all the talks I decided, and particularly after Gerald's presentation that we might return later, I decided to choose two fragments, two video, and one, it will bring us maybe to the beginning of this conference, when in the first day was discussed the issue of the end of history, and also that starting point, 89, and actually it was a bit confusing speculation, because I think that the voices somehow split between two poles, and one somehow sounded that actually before 89 there was some kind of another dimension of horizon and something closed with 89. But of course there is another position that actually I'm quite confessed to it, that actually 89 was amazing year of openness, so of beginning something new, and then the history of betrayal, because actually there is quite speculative tendency of, even on the part of very brilliant people like Badiou interpretation of perestroika as a betrayal of communist hypothesis, that actually we completely disagree. It was very live competing process, and the sources of that political forces standing behind perestroika was openly left. Even Gorbachev was kind of idealistic social democrats. Unfortunately had to face most reactionary new liberal tendency in world politics like Thatcher, Reagan, Kohl, and all that gang of world politicians. So let me show you one fragment that actually gives some material feeling how situation changed through the chronology of political manifestation on the street of St. Petersburg. We first time managed to digitalize this material, they were never shown, and it also gives us some kind of feeling relating to history in a more direct way. So you called your collective as a sound collective. I was thinking, what about studio? And I think we also, in many sense, film collective. That's why the way how we communicate with the world through the movies, through the films. So let's start with the first fragment. And yesterday I discovered that that might be one very important video comment on the discussion that actually continues today. So I'm very happy with this choice of this fragment, but I will talk about it later. So just first, it's about 10 minutes. So this was a first fragment, and then we jump with aftermath of these exciting events, because actually I hope you understand that for me it was really interesting to reconfigure that political dimension of the crowd, how it started with a few people, how collapsed that winter scene of last official communist demonstration. But right now I would like to show very short fragment from films that we did in Serbia and partisan Songspiel that I think could serve as interesting comment to that discussion on the switch between two modes of politics, so that politics based on another massive idea of mass mobilization, party politics, partisanship, a new form of social struggle based on identitarian one case, and how these protagonists that we constructed in our film reacted on some basic things. But you will see, and then maybe we keep discussing that. So. What's that?
Radnik misli da je Kosovo Srbija.
Invalid misli da je Kosovo Srbija.
Lezbejka tako ne misli.
Romkinji je sve svejedno.
Srbija Srbima, tako misli invalid.
Srbija Srbima, tako misli radnik.
A Romkinja tako ne misli.
A lezbejka tako ne misli.
Da li Romkinja hoće revoluciju?
Ne.
Da li radnik želi revoluciju?
Ne.
Da li invalid želi revoluciju?
Ne.
Da li lezbejka želi revoluciju?
Ne.
Šta hoće Romkinja?
Bolji život.
Šta hoće radnik?
Bolji život.
Šta hoće invalid?
Bolji život.
Šta hoće lezbejka?
Bolji život.
Bolji život. Bolji život.
Bolji život.
Naša borba nije završena.
Tražite nove partizane, naše eksplozije priušuje vatra, njihovi protiv vešaci.
Oni će se opametiti,
Oni se trude, tražite nove partizane,
njihovi protiv večnosti.
njihovi protiv vešasti.
Tražite nove partizane,
Zbijajte redove drugovi,
tražite, zbijajte redove drugovi. Tražite, zbijajte redove. Tražite.
Radnik misli da je Kosovo Srbija.
Invalid misli da je Kosovo Srbija.
Lezbejka tako ne misli.
Romkinji.
So, and just last things. Just maybe to quickly jump into discussion, because at the ending of this film particularly I haven't heard Hita's talk and I didn't know what it would be about, but here we have also kind of another form of perspective, but actually it's also symbolized that old model of communist subjectivity are leaving us and disappearing somewhere in the sky. That's why they're flying away and leaving people on the lawn. So, and I think it's really was very important remark done by Hita that actually somehow she provoked us to rethink how far we can stuck with that kind of messianic model of relation to horizon and the future in a more determinist way, or maybe not. So for me it's open questions, so I don't know, but it definitely many things change and we have to face these changes in a very sober, realistic way.
Thanks for both of those presentations. I'm wondering if it would be useful and interesting for each of you to if you have any reflections on the earlier part of the day today and the discussion of horizons, and particularly in relationship to aesthetics and politics, and how it might relate or connect to your own work. Whether you found anything particularly useful this morning or problematic at the same time. Robert.
I'm not sure. You know, I've been sitting and listening in these past 2 days, and one of the things I've been listening to very strongly, actually, so there are two questions that have been resonating very strongly for me. One was from the first day, which was the question that Julie Alt asked at the end, at the conversation at the end of the day, that final conversation, where at a certain point she turned to Simon and she said, you know, you're asking a lot of art. What is it that you actually want from us? And it's made me think a lot about the sort of desires that have been sort of circulating over the course of the past 2 days about what art is actually going to, what its possibilities are. And I think there is a certain sort of this messianic figure, this redemptive notion of the artwork. And then I also think of that sort of extraordinary sort of image that Beatrice gave us of these graduate students being able to wield hammers and actually sort of stick things up and make things, and that you have these kinds of profoundly different images in a certain way of these demands that are being made of the process. And I have quite frankly listened to this figure of the horizon as a kind of location or even a screen for a series of sort of intense demands, and behind which appear to lie an extraordinary sense of anxiety and a kind of hopelessness that in a way I think is also part of the sort of mournful shadow of this notion of the former West. You know, and that sort of question, what is to be done, how you actually hear that question, hear it as a kind of defeatism, as a kind of sort of ending, or as genuinely a sort of a call to a kind of movement. So that was the first day. Today there was a question that I found, you know, incredibly compelling as well, which is a question that came from the audience after Hito's presentation, which was, so is there something in actually this sort of geography that you've described to us that may suggest a different possibility of organizing these conversations? And it made me think a great deal about, I think one of the most important venues that I would say for my art practice is actually my teaching in art schools. This is never going to reach the threshold of the art institution. It's never going to reach the threshold of the curator. It's never going to sort of circulate within these kinds of venues and these kinds of conversations, but it is an extraordinary place for mobilization, for organizing, and for praxis. And one of the things that that I have found, it's a simple device that I have found incredibly useful. That's something I would love to have been able to do here, which is to say, can we reorganize this space? And in the process of reorganizing this space, actually begin to give expression in a certain way to the configurations, the materializations, both of this kind of mournfulness that seems to be part of the tone that runs through these conversations, as well as these incredible desires and demands that are being made in a way of this institution of art in relation to these questions of politics. So part of what is sort of helpful for me today, in a certain sense, is in many ways a reminder of the extraordinary pleasures of the practice that Ultra Red engages in, which is to sit with small groups of people over many sessions and to actually work together, as opposed to the kind of sort of rush of declaration, observation, and of demand that has gone by so incredibly swiftly. So in a certain sense, this is a call at this point, at the ending of this event, in anticipation of a year's time, for a consideration, in a certain sense, of the configuration of this reflection itself, and the extent to which it is in its own way is a practice, and is there something worth thinking about in relation to this practice that may in fact be an important point of intervention in some way.
Thanks for that. Dmitry, do you want to pick up on that maybe?
No, I'm absolutely, because it was actually comes from our talks at the back of this conference, how it would be really important to reconfigure. And I actually, in our practice, when we transform in our seminars or our modes where we completely fed up with all that kind of traditional presentational academic mode of encountering each other, so that's why we're permanently trying to subvert it into different forms of more direct bodily communication. So I would imagine if you start to run here dance workshop and hearing workshop, I think we maybe approach the issues of horizon in a more intense and in a more complex way even. But at the same time, I think it's really somehow this problematization of horizons and former West, it really reflects certain, from my point of view, big confusions that we have faced all today. I mean, at certain historical moment. So today was kind of basic generalization. Again, we watch the conflict between micropolitics in the form of Gerald Browning articulation and Laclau with that concept of statism, and finally decided that we all again need to try to develop new forms of organization, different from saturated party model, and definitely share general concerns that micro-political forms of politics doesn't work. And we need to find some way in between, and we all quite agree on that for quite a long time. You remember also Lazarata, new mode of coordination, whatever you call it, but at the same time, we're trying to experiment. And I think it's still, maybe we are very much into that contemporary mode. Because sometimes, you know, in Russia in particular, we think sometimes, guys, look how many years or decades took working class to accept certain mode of organization. More than a century, I would say, maybe more. And right now we are definitely in one very crucial historical moment, and we should recognize and maybe as Debord said once, I really love this definition, that true critique is a critique that knows how to wait. So right now, I agree that the speed of all that exchanges that really somehow undermine the content, the message that might be much more profound in educational sense. So in the way, for me right now, it's a big issue how the things that we discuss here, if they possible that they become a social fact, how they affect society, not just very important academic debate and maybe very closed artistic circles. So that's the issue. That's why we really trying to experiment with that kind of popular form of music and cinema. So I don't know, but sometimes it works, but I think we really have kind of ideas that it's a long, long run.
I'm curious about one aspect of the fact that we have your two you represent two in some ways groups that have a lot of shared affiliations and political goals and strategies, but there are some differences, particularly in terms of your aesthetics of silence compared to your representative politics. Yeah, music and performance and theater. I'm wondering if you can talk about those different, if that's how you feel about that difference and about the approach of the other group.
Yeah. I mean, TJ, I think part of it is that you're interested in finding a point of difference because that is the sort of drama of a debate. And and I actually don't think we're that far different at all. This sort of idea of actually taking time. It was something that Hito mentioned as well, which we actually need time to be able to digest the very profoundly different propositions that have been made around this figure of the horizon. And to really be able to sort of sit and contemplate those in some way, it has been so sort of systematically dissected, but in very different methodologies and with very different vocabularies. And the sort of pedagogical process that is required, I mean, there is a certain sense in which I would love to have stopped on that first day and said, all right, can we do that again? Could you just could you take us through that again? It is a piece of knowledge I would love to hear. Can we actually be in a pedagogical relationship around these kinds of issues? And that's happened over and over in a certain sense, is to be able to sort of take the time. And I think there is a way in which both of us, as we've discussed our practices, actually have different sort of strategies in a certain sense in appearance, but actually fundamentally a lot of it is about taking the time to be able to sort of sit and discuss. And so this kind of notion of silence is really just very simply, and I'm going to keep on talking about this in the most sort of mundane and practical ways, as opposed to stepping into a kind of highly arcane theoretical discussion about these sorts of things, because I think it is in a certain sense the value of a kind of just a systematic being together and taking the time to sort of be together. I mean, there is something in, there is a kind of a humor, there is a kind of in a way the sort of defeatism. And this is a question that I would sort of have for you, Dmitry. In a way, there's a certain sort of sense in which I've read some of your writing about, in a way, the value of defeat. And there is something about the way in which the humor functions in the work that I think begins to produce a new sort of space of listening or awareness in reflection to this. I mean, just this last piece that we've actually seen here, the kind of a chorus of contradictions that get laid out there, but with this kind of in this parodic way, begins to sort of constitute or construct a sort of a space of reflection that is a very different tone from the spaces of reflection that we would constitute, which are, in a certain sense, the word neutral isn't quite accurate, but they're sort of, they're fairly flat. in the way in which we work. There's not much room for a kind of irony, and I think the openings that produces for us is quite different. I've sort of thought, in thinking about your work, I thought of the figure of this horizon. What would it be to try and actually bring it into a very strong sort of ironic position? Because we've been hearing a kind of solemnity around this idea of the horizon and of the former West, that I can only imagine if you were to then turn this into a songspiel, what sort of openings would emerge from that in some way?
Yeah, so actually I really enjoy your comment, and I think sometimes we really need a little bit more silence. But you know, meanwhile, just a half an hour ago we come to idea, and I'm sure we implemented that we do kind of long-term seminars, что делать and alter it together. Maybe this combination of completely different methods, if they combined together, maybe run to some very interesting result in a pedagogical way. That's why we are most interested about this kind of effect, but also kind of internal collaborations that I will be, I think, very enriching each other. So
we are using this to organize ourselves. We're instrumentalizing this event. Yeah. And I would also like to sort of mark that we have at least two other representatives of two other art collectives in the room, I think that there is something about being able to sort of talk a little bit about collectivity, how we organize ourselves, that may be useful. But I would actually like very much to be able to begin, if I may, to start sort of throwing this out into what could potentially become a broader conversation, and to begin to sort of invite some considerations of these two questions: what is to be done, what have you heard, but also potentially to hear a little bit about these issues of collectivity. Why work as artists in collectives? I mean, this is, I think, is one of the reasons why I imagine we were the ones invited here.
Hi, I'm Tony again. Thank you for intriguing openings to this conversation. I have a question for how to condition this moment of asking, what did you hear, and provide a space where we're actually able to listen. What are the barriers that we have to overcome to listen in an answer to Spivaks, can the subaltern speak, and so that we don't become mouthpieces?
I'm not sure that there actually are any particular barriers other than just to be able to say, let's listen, and to give some time to actually to do that. I mean, in our procedures, we would arrive at this point without actually conditioning it with a whole bunch of speaking ahead of time, and to have the demand for the address, to have the teaching about phenomenology emerge from within the collective's questions would be what would be useful, but to be able to get to know each other a little bit would have been really nice.
Okay. Thank you, Robert and Dmitry. I really feel that this is the place I should have been in, rather than day before yesterday, because I feel a natural solidarity and affinity with this conversation, and I feel that I've really gained enormously from what both of you have had to say. And the reason I'm saying this is I think that there is another way of thinking about listening and oral phenomena, and actually in RUX we spend a lot of time talking and thinking about listening, and that will bring me to your question about what does it mean to be a collective. Because when you're a collective, when you're more than one person, the first imperative is that you have to listen. That there is no work possible unless and until there is some kind of conviviality of listening to each other and learning to be silent when somebody speaks amongst the three of us. But also, I mean, in an early work that we made, which is a very simple poster called Utopia is a Hearing Aid, where we talked about utopian conditions as not some other time across the horizon of the future, in some other future, but actually learning to listen to the possibilities of other worlds within our world. And which then developed into a work called A Measure of Anacoustic Reason, a meditation on acoustics in a way, in their juridical and political forms, where the whole idea of earshot, which is a horizon of listening, which is a very interesting concept because you can not listen to things even if you're very close to them, right? Not being able to listen is not a function of your distance from a particular phenomenon. It's just sometimes dispositions or choices not to listen to things. And we have been very interested in judicial processes, which in the English language are often called hearings. And in a hearing, a judge can choose not to listen to a certain form of evidence. So I was just thinking that these are modes of working and modes of thinking that encouraged me to rephrase my skepticism about what is called the political in art, right? Which I expressed a few days ago. But I expressed it with the particular intention of making a demand for a greater seriousness to the political in art than I find in most political art. And what is very heartwarming for me today is to actually encounter a panel of artists whose practice, I think, is deeply political in the best sense of the word. Where your practice, to me, and that's why I share that solidarity, is not about a performance of some kind of political catharsis. It's not the presentation of some redemptive, resistant figure, which then allows us not to be actually political, right? It is to produce modes of thinking politically and modes of acting politically within our practices that anticipate other forms of organization, other forms of practice. That is why a lot of what passes for political art in the international art scenario I find actually apolitical. And that is why I find your practice, both of your practices, whenever I've seen it and had occasion to listen to it, profoundly significant and political. So thank you for sharing it.
Julie, do you want to talk about?
Yes. I actually don't want to speak about, I'm not in an active collaborative at the moment, and so I don't want to speak about a collaboration or an experience of collaboration in the past tense. And I mean, I'm not resisting, the idea to speak, but I also appreciated very much your comments about pace and contemplation and digestion of some of the things that have been going on. So I'm not urgently wanting to rush to comment, but I would say that I also think that the people that we know of that are in this room that are part of collectives or collaboratives are not the only people that are equipped to speak about the people in this room that Robert said are part of collaboratives or collectives are not the only ones who are equipped to speak about the collaborative spirit and collaborative intentionalities, collective intentionalities. So I would defer from speaking and also invite, not to put anyone on the spot, but invite the collaboration of Former West to weigh in on some of this discussion.
I'm not going to pick up the Former West tag necessarily, but I suppose in regard to the question of collaborations, I actually want to pick up your comment, which was picked up by Robert later on, and just really to, I suppose, try and clarify it in my own mind, because my worry was that it might seem in your comment that, in a sense, the questions that are being posed in this symposium, and the questions that are being posed then, I suppose, within the Former West context, should somehow be borne by the work of art, or be in some way, the work of art should in some way address these questions, yeah? and that when you're asking an awful lot of art, in a sense, that's the question that seems to be posed to the art, is how I understood it. And I think that would be a very wrong thing to do. And I think you would be absolutely right to say that it would be absurd to put that kind of expectation onto the work of art in relationship to the questions that are being posed. In other words, that the artwork, or the artist perhaps, the artist in contrast to the curator or the theorist who would phrase these questions, the artist then would be under pressure to answer it. I can't face both ways at once. I'm sorry about that. Because I think that if we interpret it through this idea of the collaborative practice, then I think there is also a certain part of the art world, and it's a minor part of the art world, I think, because the art world is largely a commodified field, which could be collectively addressing these questions. And I think that we are in these questions together as curators, as theorists, as artists, that our sense of melancholia or sense of mournfulness is a desire to get out of that, to become active again, to reclaim a sense of agency, which I think the political in its traditional way might have given us at one time. That process is something that we have to do together, and we have to do collectively. And I think that if Former West is to mean anything, it's to form the basis of a collective possibility of articulating that desire. Yeah? Not necessarily even satisfying it, but articulating it in a way which it can speak maybe outside of that art world to other fields, to the political field, or to the whatever aspects of the social we'd want to address. And I think that it's important that we understand that this is more, this discussion, this forum, and the awfulness of this layout in the room and everything like that kind of mitigates the idea that it should be some kind of an agora in which discussion between us is possible around the questions that we put on the table. That in a sense that the idea of pedagogy there has to be a collective form of learning. And the collectivity that you're talking about in terms of Ultra Red or Shtodelat or Rax is a collectivity that at least in a notional sense can extend to the art, or that part of the art field which is interested in these questions and not only interested in the marketing of product. That's what I would want to clarify, I think, before we get into this idea of disciplinary separation between the curator, the theorist, and the artist, and a kind of temporal relationship between the three.
I'm not quite sure I have much to add. Perhaps on a pragmatic level, so to speak, this is not a one-off event. This Congress, however fast the pace, is part of enormous nexus of activities that are going on for a long period of time. There's a lot of teaching involved in that. The first Former West Congress has enormous life, and I could quite easily provide numbers in a banal sense as to how often the digital archive all the lecture is being used. Lectures are being, I teach, all research advisors teach, curators of this project teach. We work with a number of institutions that have their own educational activities, etc., etc. But the lectures of congresses like this do end up in, on a list of required readings eventually. And this is how this finds way to another kind of possibility of an intimate gathering and playing and replaying. There is an opportunity. Actually, lectures of yesterday and the day before yesterday are already there and have been played and replayed. And it's fun to observe the numbers too. Not to say that it's a lot, but that the very fact that it's happening, it's for me quite important. And perhaps the next Congress. The Congress is a moment, there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of expert meetings, and we did some with Robert, we did some with Dmitry. So we witnessed that there are lots of expert meetings with just a handful of people sitting at a table, drinking tea, coffee, and other things later on. Just being together and trying to think things through together. But very organically, without us pushing, there's a whole educational platform that appeared within the project through teaching of people involved, but also working towards next Congress that will be hosted precisely in a year's time by the Akademie der Bildenden Künste in Vienna in the first week of November 2011. We actually built up a number of courses through which former West can be debated in this kind of teaching situations. And the biggest difficulty we do face, I think, or perhaps I face, the biggest difficulty I face, is indeed, and I refer, Robert, to your comment to Simon, is indeed how to deal with the notion of former West in a form of an exhibition. Indeed, not as a conclusion of the project, not as a product of all these years of thinking and doing things, but as one station within that research where certain issues can be discussed in a different way. But how do you translate, what kind of mode of translation of this debate and research you find, you invent in order to offer an exhibition that could proudly, you know, say, this is the exhibition that speaks of former West. And I think the next Congress would inevitably need to look at precisely this. How do you anchor these considerations in the piece of art, in particular artistic practices, etc., etc. But if I mention that this is a collective practice, there are indeed people different disciplines gathering together, thinking together. The congresses are moments where we try to open up to a larger group of people, slightly larger group of people who could actually negotiate the meanings with us and perhaps even correct us if there is a feeling anywhere that we on a wrong path.
Well, it's not actually a question, it's just to add what was said before to the idea of the collaborative. And I just wanted to add, I mean, I'm Iris Dressler, I'm from Stuttgart, I'm the director together with Hans from a Kunstverein. And we have some experience in collaborative projects together with artists or other curators. And I think, of course, one main condition is listening. I would really agree. And then the question is always also what is the aim of this collaboration? Is it to get a better result of something or to have more competence around a certain issue? And for me, in the different projects we made, three of the most important things are moments which are almost unbearable, which makes them very interesting. So you more and more you understand that you have a lack of knowledge in the moment you work with other people. You come to the moment to realize that you, even after the process, will not understand it. And you need to accept that there always is a certain kind of ideas, of knowledge you share, but there is always also this kind of lack which rests. And then also to accept moments of positions which are actually unacceptable for you. And in this temporal moment, you find a moment to accept that which is actually unacceptable for you. And these are experiences within this project, which for me were very challenging and very interesting. When you really come to your own borders, of understanding, of accepting, which also brings you then in another direction of rethinking issues. So it would be, when I give it back to a question, is how you deal with what is your aim, what you project as a result, if you talk about working as artists in a collective. Do you have a certain aim, or is it more about also the unexpected? Is it more about an experiment in working together, in sharing ways of working, etc.?
So it's really quite often questions that ask, what is your goal? And kind of course, it's quite far away from that kind of business calculation. But at the same time, I think for most of us in particular, I wanted a little bit comment Gerald's presentation and maybe a little bit to make it more complex, because when he was talking about that kind of speaking the truth, that Parisian position, I think it's quite easy, also not so easy, but at the same time it's possible to maintain in society that that are built on that drastic repression and clash between society and the power, or not exactly society, between old mode of antagonisms. So there you can definitely take a stance, and you know exactly on which side you own and what kind of politics you pursue. So for example, for us it's really urgency to make kind of important changes in current Russian situation, and not just, of course we understand that the sphere of cultural production is our factory where we must a little bit make mental cleansing. So it's really impossible to survive in that situation. That's why we could really stand up and say what's going on here, it's shit. So we won't participate in these games, you know. So and not just exiting, so making exodus, but at the same time instituting kind of a new look. We are a small group of people without resources, but we can demonstrate that there is another mode of production. We can produce our own means and distribution and everything. But at the same time, it's a local situation. And then you're translated that also Gerald tackles that issues between local and translocal. And you come here and you sit in the most prestigious setting of art project, and actually it's completely another understanding. I'm not sure whom I should tell the truth here, or maybe some people tell truth to me. So it's really very much more complex reconfiguration. When we are swindled between these two positions, it also kind of very interesting. But at the same time, I would put attention that actually the rest of the first world, the rest of the former West, it's actually pushed into that, still inside that very antagonistic struggle, where people face much more stronger repressions that might we risk in our cultural game or ideological fight. People are killed, journalists and activists and normal people, so it's completely another things at stake. That's why for us, I think we believe, maybe also you can correct me, maybe naively, that art has a certain power to inspire and to change people's relation to many things, from micro level to the macro level. And I think we should work on both, permanently having horizons that we must change something much bigger than just our family relation or just our spiritual ego. So of course it should go further. That's why we should think how art can find this contact with impact on society. And I think it's possible. For example, last 7 years we did kind of interesting progress. So, and I can also talk a lot about that. And also, that's why I agree absolutely with Robert, and a few things that really bring us closer, educational function and pedagogy. So I think Maria mentioned that there are a lot of teaching. There are teaching and pedagogy. Sometimes we must be very careful about words, that we mean the same thing. So of course it's heaps of academies, and lessons are taught, students are gathered in auditorium, but is it exactly that emancipatory pedagogy that we are having in mind? Is it the approach, the methods of teaching? It's exactly what we would appreciate. How this knowledge that we produce in this small audience and at the same time broadcasting everywhere, how it's accepted, how we deal with that issue. So that for us, I think, and I agree with the critical comment of Robert, we should go much further and much more, demand much more brave experiments with what produced. Then we can really reach something that we all often speculate about, that real impact on society. So.
I've been thinking a little bit about this shift that's been happening, particularly in Europe, where there seems to be less of an inclination to have conferences and more of an inclination to have congresses. And I think of, the association I have with the term Congress is that it is a gathering of people who represent constituencies. And that there is a coming together, and that a certain kind of constituency representation will occur during the period of the Congress, and there will be a return then to constituencies. And those conversations will then devolve through that sort of process until the next Congress of those representatives of the constituents actually comes together in some way. And this is, to me, sort of suggests, in a way, a kind of model to do this kind of collaborative vision that you presented as part of the sort of imminent potential of this idea of the former West. If I may take a few minutes to talk a little bit about an association I have to this that's very close to Ultrared's work. Ultrared was formed 16, 17 years ago. In Los Angeles by two artists who helped to establish the first needle exchange program in Hollywood. Now, for those of you who don't know, needle exchange is the exchange of needles used for injecting drug use, used needles for clean needles. This is one of the most effective ways of actually reducing the risk of the transmission of the HIV virus. It has been, until actually the Obama administration, illegal for the most part in the United States to actually engage in needle exchange, even though empirical research has proved time and time again that it is one of the most effective prevention methods. It leads basically to the conclusion that the state not only reneges, in this case, on its responsibility to actually serve and to ensure the health of the population, but will continue to enforce, through a certain kind of moral prescription, the very injunctions that lead to the death of citizens in some way. This arises out of AIDS activism, which is really the foundation practice of Ultrared, was the AIDS activist movement. A little footnote to this. One of the sort of dismissals or sort of reductions of group materials work on the first day of this conversation was that the AIDS timeline merely produced a kind of an emotional response. Not only was this, I think, a sort of a misrecognition, actually, of the incredible sort of analytic depth of the AIDS timeline, but also I was sort of a little troubled by the notion that sort of emotion is somehow a kind of ephemeral or an excess. AIDS activism was organized very explicitly. This was the explicit statement of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP, which was a group united in anger. And that actual sort of condition of affect was a central condition for organizing. But there's something else that I want to sort of draw attention to, which takes us back to this idea of constituency. AIDS cultural analysis was a sort of a key intellectual as well as praxis of the AIDS movement. And this was founded on this basic sort of statement. I'll say it in the form that we've heard a number of statements today. There is no such thing as AIDS. All right. This was a reformulation of a statement, there is no such thing as disease, which came out of a deep study, De Boer, I think if I remember correctly, study of the cholera epidemics a few decades earlier. That basically the structural conditions have to exist in order for an epidemic to occur. One of the key structural conditions for the AIDS crisis was the question, is the general public at risk? All right? With the very presentation of that question, the general public, an ideological condition was constituted in which injecting drug users, people may have forgotten about this or may never know about this, Haitians and homosexuals were in fact the ones who were sort of in a way excluded from the polis. They were excluded from this notion of the general public. The constant and rigorous analysis of this notion of general public through the activist processes, aided in large part, actually, by the deep work of feminism and the way in which feminism had created the political foundations for this kind of analysis to actually occur, was one of the fundamental shifts in AIDS policy that resulted in a dramatic decline in infection rates. I sort of speak about this with a certain sort of passion because this was my life for many, many years as somebody who worked in public health, who worked on the AIDS crisis intensively in South Africa and also in Brazil. And the responses at the different national levels are really profound. The responses at the national level in the United States, as opposed to the response, the denialism, Thabo Mbeki's refusal to acknowledge that, that HIV caused AIDS, and this painful, this devastating separation he created between virus and poverty, when in fact it was in Brazil, it was precisely the connection of those two things that enabled the Brazilian model to move forward in the most incredible way. And one of the key slogans of the Brazilian model, which arises very much out of the Latin American condition, is "you make the path by walking." All right, so there is something about, rather than the notion that the conditions need to be right in order for something to occur, it is through the enactment, through the action of actually these acts of solidarity that you arrive at something. The art world is deeply, deeply invested in the notion of the public. And I would like to sort of encourage us in the way in which we've been hearing this is sort of underneath a lot of what has been said over the past few days, the kind of problematizing of this notion of the public. It seems to me that this is one of the great sort of promises of this, this Congress, is for us to sort of think a little bit about the constituencies that we arrive from to this gathering. And who it is that we actually have a kind of responsibility to, who we're going to go back to, and how that actually complicates the notion, this notion of the public, and the sort of address of what in many instances is really, the public is really a code for essentially a sort of a petty bourgeois sort of patron of the arts in many ways, who becomes the kind of neutral figure. So, for example, the sort of notion that nothing interesting is happening in contemporary art, is a statement that's made in a certain sense from the position of somebody who places themselves as the generalizable consumer of the art process in some way. And of course we know that the encounters, the first and the second encounters and subsequent encounters with the art process are profoundly different, depending on who you are, where you come from, how you come into the relationship to art in some way. And so that relational foundation as a kind of opening out of the conventional address, or even, might I sort of say, the interpellation of the public that art is engaged in. I think this is a very, very important piece of work that I hear can possibly be done through this process. And it certainly is, in the terms, now that I've given you a kind of genealogy to Ultra Red's work, in the terms of that activist process of the AIDS crisis, proved to be life-saving, dare I say, and at a time where the notion of art is again, it's a repetition, sort of under attack in various ways. This question of what is the future life is something to be considered.
Thank you, Robert. I'd like to draw the conclusion to a close by asking three questions that I'm left with after today. Maria asked me if I could say a few words to sum up. And of course, I think that's an impossible task because it was such a rich day. There was so much substantive contributions that were made, so many points made, so many loose ends as well, but that's to be expected with such an event as this. Three questions which are meant to not be directed at any specific speakers, but just things that I'm left with. Surely there are many more. But the first is this issue of the dangerous speaking of truth. I'm curious, how can we speak truth? How does that operation work in a liberal democratic milieu where the media is perfectly, well equipped to delegitimize moments of speaking truth to power? A second question is, what political traction is available to us in the artistic realm when we find ourselves in the context of a free fall, without any sense of a secure horizon? And the third is how can we continue to create pedagogical spaces of collective listening and also partisanship during a period when we're witnessing and experiencing unprecedented attacks on education, at least within the academy. These are enormous questions, but I think it's appropriate to conclude by letting the discussion begin. So thank you to everyone, and particularly to our speakers, Robert Semper and Dmitry Vilensky. Thank you.